In early March, you likely saw footage of what looked like celebratory fireworks in the skies over Israel. That was not a successful defense. You were watching a single advanced Iranian missile overwhelm the world's most sophisticated air defenses by becoming hundreds of projectiles. And here is the new math of power that changes everything. That one missile, costing perhaps $250,000, forced the expenditure of over $40 million in US-made interceptors to even attempt to stop it. This is not just another regional flare-up. This is a live demonstration of a systematic dismantling of the pillars of American power. Over the next few minutes, I will give you the strategic framework to understand precisely how this equation was broken and what it means for your capital and security. It begins with the first and most critical pillar, military dominance. Let's break down the mechanics of how it is being bypassed. The math behind missile defense has just been broken. What's the one too big to fail system you've always trusted that now feels vulnerable? Share your thoughts below. So how did the math of American power break so suddenly? It starts with the first and most visible pillar, military dominance. For decades, US missile defenses like THAAD and Patriot ran on a simple logic. One threat, one response. Radar tracks a single incoming missile and assigns one advanced, expensive interceptor to kill that one target. The entire architecture was built on that linear model. Iran's new approach is designed to break that model. As the CSIS Missile Defense Project documents, Tehran has fielded missiles with cluster warheads that disperse 20 to 80 submunitions. The outer missile is the Trojan horse. On radar, it shows up as a single object, baiting the system to commit its interceptor. Then the warhead opens and releases the bomblets. Each submunition becomes its own small, fast target. A defense built for one engagement suddenly faces dozens at once. That saturation effect means one Iranian launch can function like an entire missile barrage. Defending a high-value base means treating many of those bomblets as independent threats, so one initial radar track can require multiple interceptors. Even a dozen interceptors makes the economics implode. By the Missile Defense Agency's FY 2025 budget, that a THAAD interceptor costs about $12.7 million and a Patriot PAC-3 about $4 million. That one launch forces you to spend roughly $50 to over $150 million in interceptors to stop fragments of a cheap, mass-produced missile. Understand this. The United States is firing platinum bullets at lead pellets, while the other side can stamp out what might as well be 1 million of those pellets. The US has finite stocks of expensive interceptors. Iran can mass-produce those submunitions. Former Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said publicly that America's interceptor stockpiles are running low, and Pentagon leaks echo the same message. That is the attrition equation. Every exchange hollows out the shield faster than it erodes Iran's capacity to launch. When the world's security guarantor can no longer reliably intercept missiles, how long do key allies keep anchoring their survival, their currencies, and their oil pricing on that promise? That erosion of trust is what begins to break the second pillar, America's financial dominance. For decades, that financial dominance has rested on a single, invisible foundation, the petrodollar system. When the security guarantee disappears, the financial allegiance follows. Understand the mechanism. Gulf states price their oil in US dollars, forcing buyers to hold dollars and park reserves in dollar assets. Ongoing demand for the currency and for US Treasuries. Gulf producers then recycle their profits into US Treasury bonds. That loop is the invisible engine that has allowed the United States to carry $33 trillion in debt on artificially low interest rates. But now that engine is misfiring as Washington fails to protect shipping lanes, and those same allies treat the arrangement as a liability. This isn't speculation. On March 6th, the Financial Times reported that 3 Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, are reviewing their US investments and exploring force majeure clauses on contracts tied to some $2 trillion in exposure. In parallel, UAE billionaire Khalaf Ahmad Al Habtoor published an open letter to Donald Trump, questioning America's right to drag their region into a war, language now echoing across Gulf media and business circles. Understand what that enables. For the first time, there is a non-dollar route for both energy and capital. Over the last 15 years, China has built yuan-denominated oil contracts and CIPs, a cross-border yuan settlement network outside US banking rails, giving Gulf producers a credible way to sell oil, settle payments, and reinvest surpluses without routing everything through Washington. The erosion of this petrodollar system isn't just a geopolitical headline. If it accelerates, it becomes a financial extinction-level event for the US economy. As Gulf petrodollar recycling and allied capital flows shrink, demand for US Treasuries falls, forcing Washington to offer higher yields. Those higher benchmarks ripple through banks into every other form of credit. That is the interest rate cascade. The same move that raises the government's cost of money raises the price of your mortgage, your car loan, and your credit card balance. The mechanism for this cascade is a simple, brutal chain of cause and effect. It begins with America's key creditors first understand who has been quietly helping to fund the US deficit at the margin. For decades, Gulf sovereign wealth funds have recycled their petrodollars into Western financial markets, including large positions in US Treasury bonds. That flow was the financial expression of the security guarantee. Washington protected the regimes. The regimes parked their surplus in dollar assets. Now that bargain is under review. The Financial Times and Reuters report that more than $2 trillion of Gulf overseas investments, a portfolio that includes major holdings of US and other Western assets, is being reassessed. Not all of that is treasuries, but enough of it touches US debt that when those buyers signal they are no longer automatic, the market has to reprice what America pays to borrow. That is the moment the first domino starts to lean. A critical source of marginal demand for US debt is shifting from guaranteed to conditional. When a player of that size becomes more selective, demand for treasuries doesn't have to collapse for prices to move. It just has to weaken at the edge. Fewer large, reliable bids for new bond issuance mean the same volume of government debt has to clear at lower prices. In the bond market, lower prices are simply the flip side of higher yields. That shift immediately corners the US Treasury. The federal government is still running enormous deficits. It still has to roll and issue debt. If traditional Gulf buyers are stepping back or attaching new conditions, the Treasury must pull in more skeptical capital from elsewhere. To do that, it has to sweeten the terms. In plain language, it must offer a higher yield to make those bonds worth holding. Understand this, because this is where geopolitics hits your monthly payment. The yield on the 10-year Treasury is not just a trader's number. It is the base reference for the cost of money across the American economy. As that benchmark is forced higher, the entire curve of borrowing costs lifts with it, from your next mortgage and car loan, to your credit cards, to the rate on your business credit line. We are already watching this mechanism fire. On the news of Hormuz shipping disruptions and the first visible signs of Gulf capital pulling back, the 10-year US yield jumped above 4.1%. Markets read the combination clearly. Higher geopolitical risk, less automatic Gulf demand for US paper, and therefore a higher risk premium on American debt. The cost of everything you borrow is being repriced upward, and that doesn't stop with your personal balance sheet. When benchmark rates rise like this, households divert more cash to interest and less to consumption. Highly leveraged companies face tighter credit and daily investment, and marginal projects simply don't get financed. Growth slows even as the original shock, disrupted shipping lanes and more expensive imported goods keeps upward pressure on prices. You end up with the most dangerous mix for a developed economy. More expensive money, more fragile demand, and no guarantee that inflation actually comes down. This is the direct financial consequence of a broken security promise and a shifting capital base. But the same realignment that is draining our financial reservoirs and raising our funding costs is also degrading something less visible: the information, access, and cooperation that our intelligence system used to take for granted in this region. The next stage of this conflict is not only about fighting with more expensive debt, it is about fighting with less visibility. And the question we now have to confront is simple: why, with all our tools, can't we see what's coming? The reason we cannot see what is coming is that the third and most critical pillar of American power is being systematically neutralized: information dominance. For decades, Washington has planned on the assumption of an all-seeing eye over the battle space. That assumption no longer holds. We are watching an anomaly in Iran's strike performance that does not match its prior record. Tehran is hitting sensitive, mobile, and clandestine targets with a level of precision that by historical standards should be out of reach. This is not random luck or a small tweak in guidance software. It signals a shift in the intelligence balance, not just in the missiles. A US THAAD radar system in Jordan, mobile by design, was struck at its deployed position, with open-source footage and satellite imagery geolocating the impact to the radar's exact footprint. Buildings used by Mossad personnel, whose locations are tightly compartmented, were also singled out and hit. And there are regional reports, less well substantiated, but consistent with this pattern, of strikes on specific hotel rooms in Bahrain used by American officials. Under normal security and dispersal protocols, all three should have been extremely hard to find and verify in time. These are not just accurate shots. They represent access to information Western intelligence is built to keep sealed. Among defense and satellite analysts, one working hypothesis stands out. China is supplying Iran with near real-time high-resolution satellite imagery and targeting data. Human sources, isolated cyber penetrations, or leaks from local partners can sometimes compromise a single site. They do not explain a sequence of strikes on a mobile air defense unit like THAAD, covert intelligence facilities, and short-stay hotel rooms across several countries in narrow time windows. That pattern points toward broad, persistent overhead ISR support, rather than a lucky run of local penetrations. Public CSIS assessments and commercial imagery studies document how rapidly Beijing has expanded its satellite constellations over the Middle East, providing high-resolution coverage with frequent revisits, functionally comparable for targeting in this theater to US systems. At the same time, China's tightening coordination with Russia and Iran through exercises, technology transfer, and aligned diplomatic positions has the practical effect of constraining US freedom of action
and eroding Washington's influence over regional security decisions.
The implication is severe. When an adversary can see your high-value assets in near real-time, forward bases, air defense systems, and naval platforms face shorter warning times, higher exposure, and far less freedom to mass forces without being targeted. Without information superiority, US power projection advantages are sharply blunted, and the military and financial pillars become more fragile because protecting carriers, bases, and critical trade routes becomes much harder. But neutralizing America's military, financial, and intelligence pillars is only the beginning. The rules of engagement are shifting again. The battlefield is now expanding beyond traditional domains and is starting to reach directly into the physical infrastructure of the global economy itself. And that expansion is no longer a theoretical threat. It has begun. The fourth pillar of American power, the economic infrastructure that underpins the digital world, is now under direct kinetic attack. On or around March 2nd of this year, Iranian strikes triggered a fire at an Amazon Web Services data center in the United Arab Emirates. Understand, this was not collateral damage. It was a calculated message. Tehran is willing to escalate from hitting bases and oil facilities to striking the physical backbone of the global digital economy, forcing Western planners to treat data centers as frontline assets. An attack on an airbase disrupts military operations. An attack on an AWS data center hits the economy itself. This is the physical heart of modern globalism. The hardware that runs cloud services for thousands of companies, routes financial transactions, stores corporate data, and keeps e-commerce online. It is also the engine for the region's trillion-dollar AI ambitions. When the March 2nd strike set that facility on fire, it disrupted cloud services for thousands of customers and marked the first major kinetic attack on a hyperscale data center in the Gulf. As one headline in Rest of World magazine put it, the region sold itself as a safe harbor for the world's data. That illusion is now shattered. For boardrooms and risk committees, a strike like this forces a repricing of Gulf exposure. It directly threatens the massive tech build-out underway, including Microsoft's plan to invest about $15 billion in UAE cloud and AI infrastructure by 2029. Insurance premiums rise, redundant regions become mandatory, and sovereign risk models now have to assume that hyperscale data centers are legitimate wartime targets. The battlefield has expanded to the core assets of Western prosperity. And that leads to the final, most direct threat. In the aftermath of these strikes, US cyber and homeland security authorities, along with analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, have warned of what they describe as a potential Phase 2. Iranian-linked cyber operations against critical infrastructure inside the United States itself, power grids, water systems, and financial networks. Those warnings are based on how Iranian messaging and cyber posture have shifted since the strikes, signaling a willingness to push the conflict into the digital infrastructure of the US homeland. So we have a military pillar buckling under asymmetric math, a financial pillar cracking as the petrodollar system unwinds, an intelligence pillar blinded by new technology, and now an economic pillar under direct physical assault. These are not isolated crises. They are interlocking fronts in what is effectively a single undeclared struggle over who controls the next world order. To understand the playbook, to see how this sequence of events fits a predictable historical pattern, we have to turn to the work of Ray Dalio. His model of the big cycle of empires is the key, and it points to one conclusion: We are entering the last, most dangerous stage of the cycle. The great disorder that precedes a change in world order. That model is Ray Dalio's big cycle of the rise and fall of empires. Built on 500 years of history, it tracks how powers like the Dutch and the British move from dominance to overextension, then into a late stage where debt is high, rivals have caught up, and their rules stop being enforced. Dalio labels that stage 6, the Great Disorder, the phase when stressed empires are tested on military, financial and geopolitical fronts at the same time. Seen through that lens, what we're watching now in the Middle East is not another messy, short-lived flare-up. It is a textbook Stage 6 test. The old rules are eroding, and the global operating system drifts toward might makes right. Treaties are bent, red lines are probed, and grey zone attacks that once would have triggered a unified response are instead absorbed. In February 2026, Dalio put it bluntly. It's official. The world order has broken down. There is a clash of great powers. You see what that clash looks like here. The military, financial, intelligence, and economic pillars of American power are being hit together. Bases and assets under cluster missile fire, dollar channels worked around. Intelligence networks exposed and constrained. And key economic targets struck. What looked, chapter by chapter, like separate crises are in fact synchronized blows in a single multi-domain campaign. That is the core of the equation to understand. Dalio's curve shows that once an empire reaches this late stage, coordinated pressure across its military, financial, intelligence, and economic systems is what appears. In his Dutch and British cases, you see the same convergence of hits across trade, finance, and security. The pattern is the same now, multi-front stress that offers no clean win. In Dalio's model, that is the strategic trap of Stage 6. Late-stage powers must decide between overextending to defend an order they can barely finance, or pulling back and signaling that the order is already gone. That is where the United States now sits. A conventional military escalation here means surging forces, munitions, and logistics into contested air and sea corridors on top of an already heavy debt load and stretched supply chains. The financial and logistical math breaks. Yet a pullback would be read by allies as proof that American security guarantees are negotiable, accelerating alliance drift and speeding the flight of capital away from the dollar. Understand that these are not just bad options. They are late cycle symptoms of a system with no easy moves left. That is why this is not a problem. Washington can simply solve, but a structural condition it has to navigate. So as this old order unravels, the question shifts. What is the new calculus for your own security, your capital, and your future? The new calculus for your capital begins with a blunt acceptance. The old equation is broken. Throughout this analysis, we've shown the 4 pillars of American power breaking: military dominance challenged, financial alliances strained, intelligence reach blunted, economic infrastructure pulled into the line of fire. The world where America's power was the fixed variable is over. As a senior Middle East strategist, we cited earlier put it, the world that's being built in the wreckage of this conflict doesn't have America at its center. This war just put it on fast forward. This is not doom, it's clear-eyed realism. That 4-pillar breakdown means your positioning has to change, because the risk surface is different now, and so must be the way you defend your capital. First, the financial siege and petrodollar erosion point to structurally higher inflation and rates. Reevaluate your bonds toward shorter duration paper and tips.
and add weight to hard assets like commodities and strategic non-USD currencies. Second, as the economic battlefield moves on to digital infrastructure, treat tech exposure as geopolitical risk. Reevaluate big tech positions, favor firms with resilient, globally distributed infrastructure, and consider dedicated exposure to cybersecurity. Understanding this new map of risk is the first step to navigating it successfully. The world order is changing faster than ever. If you want to stay ahead of these shifts and understand the new rules of money and power, make sure you subscribe and click the bell.